Thank you so much. I'm the Canadian import for the day. Go hockey, that's right. So 13 years ago, there was this guy by the name of Wesley Autry who was in New York at the subway station, and he was on the platform with his daughters, and he was waiting for the train. And as he's waiting for the train to arrive, he noticed this man was walking really unsteadily close to the edge of the platform, and he fell down onto the tracks. Wesley ran, looked, saw that the man was having a seizure, was completely out of it. So he jumped from the platform onto the tracks to try to grab the man to lift him back up. But when he got down there and tried to get this seizuring man up in his arms, he didn't have the strength to lift him up. No one else was jumping onto the tracks. And suddenly, Wesley looked down the tracks and saw lights from an oncoming train. He didn't have the strength to lift the man up, and he had a choice. He could abandon the seizuring man and get back up on the platform himself. Or, in some way, he could attempt a rescue. Well, it's that second option that Wesley Autry chose. He looked at the space between the two tracks, and he thought, if I squish this man into that space and I lay my body on top of his, it's possible that that's just enough room for us to clear if the train comes over. And so he laid the man's body down, he put his body over him, and the conductor of the train saw a man on the tracks. He put the brakes on, but he wasn't able to stop the train in time. And not just one, not just two, but 5 rail cars rolled over the bodies of those men. After 5 cars went over them, it came to a stop. Miraculously, the men survived. Miraculously, they were unharmed. The only indicator of what had happened was some grease from the train had gotten onto Wesley Autry's hat. The 21 to 23 inches of space was just enough for the thickness of their bodies to protect them from meeting their death by train. St. Thomas Aquinas once said, "To love is to will the other's good." And when I think of that definition in the context of what Wesley Autry did, most certainly his act was a demonstration of love. But I would say it is more than that. There's a short video clip by the group Abort 73 called Opposites. And in this video, they say love, if hate is the opposite of love, they ask in this video, what is the opposite of the greatest love? And then they define the greatest love, and they say, the greatest love has long been defined as a willingness to lay down your life for the other. Wesley Autry didn't just demonstrate love. He demonstrated the greatest love. But if that's what the greatest love is, then what is its opposite? The opposite of the greatest love is laying down another's life for yourself. And that's what abortion is. It is laying down the life of the youngest of our kind for ourselves. And we have a choice as pro-lifers. Are we going to abandon preborn children who are potentially at risk of being victims of the opposite of the greatest love? Or are we to be an example of the greatest love and attempt a rescue, the way Wesley Autry attempted a rescue and succeeded in helping the seizuring man? So what I want to talk about this morning is how we can rescue preborn children. But there's a difference between how we rescue them and how Wesley Autry rescued the seizuring man, because he literally was able to lay his body over in a protective way. We can't do that for preborn children. Their mothers are designed to do that by their wombs. So we have to winsomely engage women. We have to winsomely engage women and men who are around the woman in crisis and convince them, inspire them to want to protect the life of the preborn child and inspire them to demonstrate the greatest love, not its opposite. So how do we do that? How do we be rescuers in the context of winsome engagement? Well, there are 3 ways I want to talk about how we can attempt the rescue of preborn children. We need to ask good questions, we need to tell good stories, and we need to be good examples through our living witness. Questions, stories, and witness. I remember once speaking to a group of teenagers, and this boy came up to me who was defending abortion, and he was quite hostile. And he looked at me with fire in his eyes, and he said, well, what if you have a 12-year-old girl, and she's raped by her father, and she's pregnant with a deformed fetus, and she's gonna die? And I thought to myself, okay, I could take a full hour on each one of those topics, and he just had to take the most intense ones and blend them into one scenario. But before I responded, I thought to myself, what is this guy communicating to me but not verbalizing? What is he actually saying? And so I translated in my mind what he'd actually said. And I thought to myself, what he really said to me was, what if you have a 12-year-old girl and her circumstances are hard? They're hard. They're really, really hard. And once I translated what he'd said in my mind to that, I thought what I really need to convict him of is the importance of doing the right thing even when it's hard. And so I thought the way I think I can do that is ask him a question. And so I looked at this student and I said, I have a question for you. I promise I will answer your question. I think I can best answer it by asking you some questions. Would that be okay? My first question was just to seek his permission to enter into that back and forth dialogue. He said, well, what's your question? I said, okay, well, I'm going to give you a warning. It's going to seem totally random and off topic to what you said, but I promise you it's connected. So then I narrated what I was going to do. And then I said to him, is there anyone who inspires you? And he just went silent. And I thought, what if he doesn't have an answer? So I thought, I'll give him some categories. So I said, is there some character in a movie you've watched or a book you've read or maybe someone you know personally or someone in history or someone you just admire from a distance? Is there anyone who inspires you and lifts your spirits? He went quiet longer. And then he broke his silence by saying, yeah, there is someone. And he named a name. I had no idea who the person was. But that's okay, because I believe in the power of questions. So the moment he mentioned this person's name, I said, I don't know that person. Please tell me about him. And so he began to elaborate and became quite animated and excited as he was telling me about this person who was like this pro wrestler who, was really good at his sport. Is that what it's called, a sport, wrestling? I don't know. Anyways, he was really good at it. And so he was really excited, but he was telling me this guy came from a background which was really hard. Broken family, one of his relatives had committed suicide and went through a lot of hardship. And so as I was drawing all of this out, I was able to ask him questions like, well, it sounds like this guy did difficult things. He's like, he did. I said to him, it sounds like he faced challenging hardships, but didn't give up on life even when people around him did. He said, that's correct. And so as I'm drawing all this stuff out, I said, it sounds to me like you're inspired by someone who's been in difficult circumstances, but doesn't give up on life and focuses on others more than himself and does right things even when it's hard. He's like, yeah, so what? And having drawn all of that out, I said, when you talk about that 12-year-old girl raped by her father, pregnant with a deformed fetus and going to die, for me to tell you that she ought to reject abortion is not an easy thing to say, because it's not an easy act for her to live out by carrying that pregnancy to term. But it sounds to me like, based on this person you're inspired by, that what lifts your spirits, but what makes you want to follow someone, is when someone has been in hardship but not given up on life, not hurt others or themselves, but done the right thing even when it's hard. So perhaps that can be the core of our message when someone's in the crisis situation like you described. And the guy that began all fiery in his eyes when talking with me was very calm and pensive and receptive to that perspective. But I do want to give you some specifics that we can speak to in each of those circumstances. If we start with the first one he mentioned, a 12-year-old girl. He's focusing on the age of the mother, her youthfulness. And as pro-lifers, we can agree that to be pregnant and very young without marriage or a partner of some sort to support you would be very difficult. Imagine, I'll say, going from affirmation to launching in a very simple story. Imagine, I'll say, you've got a young teenager who's pregnant, but doesn't think she's too young, is quite excited to be pregnant. I mean, there's whole reality TV shows based on this premise, right? So imagine you have someone in that situation, gives birth to her child, is still happy, but maybe a month after birth, she suddenly thinks to herself, I am too young to be a mother. I would ask a question. Would we ever allow that young teenage mom to kill her born child because of the mother's age? The abortion supporter will say, no. So then we ask, why would we ever allow someone to kill a preborn child because of the mother's age? Or take the next example that he had given, 12-year-old girl raped by her father. As pro-lifers, again, we can agree on something. Rape is a terrible evil. There are no words to capture how vile that is and how brutal it is to the victims. I have several friends who have been victimized in that way. So we acknowledge that that's a terrible injustice, and then we ask a question. Will the act of abortion unrape a rape victim? I often then tell the story of my friend Leanna Rebelito, who's also a public speaker. When she was 12 years old, she was kidnapped in Mexico City where she was growing up, held for days and brutally raped. She became pregnant. She was offered an abortion. And she decided to carry that pregnancy to term and then raise her daughter, who became her best friend. When I first met her, she told me that because of the rape, she was suicidal shortly after it had occurred. And she said she was tempted to end her life, but the reason she didn't was because she was pregnant. She knew if she ended her life, it would end the baby's life. And so it was because she got pregnant that she never killed herself. When I first met her, she looked me in the eye and she said, Stephanie, I saved my daughter's life, but she saved mine. Her daughter became her will to live. If we go back to that question, I was asked, 12-year-old girl raped by her father, pregnant with a deformed fetus. When it comes to poor prenatal diagnosis, all too often the perspective we have is negative. And we can't necessarily undo the diagnosis. If the child has Down syndrome, that genetic condition cannot be undone. There is no cure for that anomaly. But we can undo our negative perception, and we can make it a more positive one. There's this great illustration of the power of changing perspective in a little reflection written by a woman by the name of Emily Pearl Kingsley. And in this reflection, she talks about how having a child with genetic and physical difference can be much like this. And she proposes this little story. She says, imagine having a baby is like going on a trip to Italy. You're super excited. You've been planning for this. You can't wait. She goes, imagine in planning for this trip to Italy, you are like researching, you're learning the language, you're envisioning all the places you're going to go. You're going to go to Venice, you're going to go to see Michelangelo's David, you're going to go to the Colosseum, all these things. You're super excited. She's like, the day comes. You board the plane. You get on board, and you get in your seat. You're super excited. You fall asleep for the overseas flight. And when you wake up, the plane is landing. And just as it lands, the pilot comes over the system, PA system, and says, well, folks, welcome to Holland. And you're like, Holland? I'm going to Italy. But you find out when you've landed in Holland that you're not going to ever get to Italy. She's like, that's what it's like, going from just being excited to have a baby to finding out your child has a disability. There's that immediate moment of dashed dreams. And you're suddenly disappointed thinking about all the things that you won't see, all the places you won't go, all the things you won't do. But she goes, if you allow yourself just a few moments to think beyond that, you come to realize that it's not like you've landed in a terrible, horrible, ugly, filthy place. It's just different. Holland is less flashy than Italy. It's a slower pace of life than Italy. But when you get off that plane and you look around, you see Holland is tulips. Holland is windmills. Holland is Rembrandt. That ought to be our perspective, she conveys, when it comes to having a child with disability, to not just focus on the negative of what you've lost, but to focus on the positive of what you've gained. The last tough case that teenager proposed to me was, and the girl's gonna die. And when people bring up that situation, I often ask them to imagine this, and I tell a little story. I'll say, imagine you have the same path that you drive home every day after school to get home. But one day, when you're driving home, you get halfway there, and there's a big sign up that says road closed. And you can see, in fact, just beyond the sign, literally the road has been ripped up. It says road closed, but then there's other signs that say detour ahead, and you follow all those orange signs, and you eventually get home. You just don't get home the way you always get there. When the woman's life is in danger, having an abortion is like driving part way and then seeing or thinking of having an abortion is like seeing a sign that says road closed. You want to save the mother's life. You want to get home, but the act of abortion as the way to get there, you can't do. Road closed. But just because the road is closed, just because I'm saying you cannot have an abortion to save her life, doesn't mean there's not a detour ahead. We just take a few other streets. And that's a simple illustration in order to demonstrate that there are things we can do to reach the goal of saving her life by directly addressing the underlying medical condition without directly and intentionally killing the child, which is always closed to us. But we can still save her life. Having said all of that, when I dialogue with people, I often hear them say, but at the end of the day, if it's my body, it's my choice. So I like to ask someone who says that a question. A question I like to ask is this: does a woman with a negative pregnancy test ever call up an abortion clinic and make an appointment? I'll say, for example, imagine someone hasn't yet taken the test. They don't want to be pregnant. If they are pregnant, they're thinking, I'm going to have an abortion. They take the test and it's negative. Does she call the clinic? And they say, no, of course not. And I say, but when she takes the test and it's positive, does she call the clinic? And they say, yes. And I say, so what is the positive test telling her that the negative test isn't? The positive test is telling her it's not just your body. There's another body there. That's why she's now thinking of going to the clinic, an action she wouldn't take if the test was negative. So if you believe my body, my choice, but you're only acting with a positive test, that's conveying there's another body in your body. So what about that person's body and that person's choice? Having said that, I often find abortion supporters will deny that that other body is a human being like you or me. So I like to ask them a general question, and I will ask this: do you believe in human rights? Now, if you ask someone if they believe in human rights, what are they likely to say? Yes. So then I like to ask this: who gets human rights? I'll ask, if women get women's rights and children get children's rights, then wouldn't it follow that humans get human rights? So the next question we ask is this: when does science say human beings begin their lives? And if you look at embryology texts, if you look at biology texts, they consistently teach that beings which reproduce sexually begin their lives at fertilization, begin their lives at sperm-egg fusion. The next question we can ask is this: what are the parents of an embryo at fertilization? Is the pregnant woman human? Is her partner human? If yes, then wouldn't it follow that that embryo must be of the same species, must be human as well? We can also ask, is the embryo growing? Is the one cell growing into 2 and 4 and 8 and doubling every time? And if yes, then wouldn't it follow by the embryo's growth, the embryo's alive? If yes, the parents are human, wouldn't it follow the embryo's human? And if yes, we believe in human rights, then wouldn't it follow that that young human have the same human rights as you or me? Another question I like to ask is this: when does parenthood begin? And what do civil societies expect of parents? If we start with that second question, if you were to go to Google and you were to type in parents kill, starve, maim children, you get horrifying headlines of profound abuse that has happened to young children around the world. And there's universal outrage around that. Whether someone supports abortion or opposes abortion, there is this acceptance that civil societies expect parents to care for their kids, not harm their kids. So if that's what civil societies expect of parents, then when does parenthood begin? Well, parenthood begins when offspring begin. The male and female become father and mother when there is offspring, and since the offspring, we know from a few questions ago, begin at fertilization, then parenthood begins at fertilization. Is the child vulnerable and dependent then? Yes. But wouldn't that vulnerability heighten our responsibility? The United Nations answers that question essentially by saying it does. Vulnerability heightens responsibility because they have a document called the Declaration on the Rights of the Child. And in the document it says the following: the child, by reason of his physical and mental immaturities, has rights to special safeguards and care before as well as after birth. End quote. They acknowledge that because the child is immature, the child gets special protections. Another point I like to make to people is the United Nations has adopted a document called the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In this document, it says, in countries where the death penalty is legal, it may never be done on a pregnant woman. What would be a good question to ask? Why? What is the difference between a guilty woman who's committed a crime that in her country is worthy of the death penalty, who is not pregnant, and a guilty woman who's committed a crime that in her country is worthy of the death penalty and who is pregnant? What is the difference between these two guilty women? In the body of one of these guilty women is an innocent child. And we may debate about whether the guilty should ever get the death penalty, but we all agree that the innocent should never get the death penalty. So we ask people this question: if it's wrong to kill the preborn child by way of the death penalty, wouldn't it be wrong to kill the preborn child by way of abortion? So if we want to be rescuers of preborn children, to win people to the reasonableness of the pro-life perspective, we want to ask questions. We want to tell stories. I once had a story told to me that was very difficult to hear. An audience member came up to me after a talk. She was unconvinced of my message that abortion was wrong because she told me she worked in a daycare, a government-funded daycare, where most of her little charges were in the foster care system. And she told me brutal stories of abuse I will not even verbalize. It was so horrifying to hear. Of course, she reported every incident of abuse that was told to her, and the kids would sometimes be plucked out of the environment they were in, put in a foster home, but a short while later they would be returned to that environment and would be unsafe once again. And she said, if you knew what I knew, if you saw what I saw, you would not want these children to suffer, and that's why we need abortion. And I said to her, I agree with you that what you've said is pure evil in terms of what happens to these kids. I agree with you that we need to respond. The question we have to ask is this: is it ethical to inflict homicide as a solution to abuse? Wouldn't homicide, we can then ask, be just another form of abuse? Wouldn't homicide be communicating to the abuser, you're right, life is disposable. Life can be treated however you want? Wouldn't that be feeding into the abuser rather than helping the abused? We can agree that abuse is a terrible evil. We want to help people see the solution doesn't have to be abortion. And that brings me to the other point that I had made. That when it comes to winning people to the pro-life perspective and being rescuers to try to win the hearts of people, to want to show the greatest love to preborn children, it's helpful to ask questions, it's helpful to tell stories, but we need to be a living example. And that living example can manifest in all kinds of ways. And I just want to give you a few examples that have touched me deeply. About a year ago at one of my talks, I met a young woman who works at a pregnancy center. She's already walking the talk by helping women in crisis. But in conversation, she said to me, I felt convicted that I needed to do more by my actions. This girl was 28 years old, she was not married, and she told me that for the previous few years, including the present day, she had fostered over 20 children. She adopted 2 of them. She's walking the talk. At that same event, I met a pastor. These were great people. I met a pastor in his 50s who told me that he was married, had several children, they were grown up, and he and his wife were currently fostering 3 children with plans to adopt all of them. I think of another couple that I met in my travels. They had given birth to their first child who was 1 year old, and they traveled overseas and adopted 2 children. They came home, they got pregnant, so they had their 4th child. Then they went back overseas and adopted 2 more children with Down syndrome who needed heart surgery, and then had more children that were biological. That is walking the talk. What is our talk? Our talk is that every single human being is valuable and has dignity and worth. So part of our witnessing is not just the examples I gave, and those are certainly powerful, but part of our witnessing is interacting with the person we're dialoguing with in such a way that they sense we see their dignity, that they sense that we reverence them, even if we disagree with them, that we see in them goodness, and as a result, we are kind. And that kindness and that patience will speak volumes to them. A few years ago, there was a coffee shop in Connecticut. Someone went through the drive-thru and thought, what? I'm going to pay for the coffee of the person behind me. So they did. And when that person drove up to pay for their coffee, they were told, the person in front of you paid for your coffee. And they were like, what? That's so nice. They're like, I'm going to pay for the person behind me. So then the next person came up and was told the same thing. They said, I'm going to pay for the person behind me. And 1,000 people paid for the coffee of the person behind them. When we are recipients of kindness and goodness, it does something to us. It makes us want to pay it forward. And I think it's important when we interact with people that we think, how can I be an example of goodness and kindness that touches them in a way even my words will not? Because when we're recipients of goodness, we want to share it. When people get married, they wear a wedding ring. What is the point of the ring? It's to be a physical reminder of the vow, the commitment, the indissolubility, the fidelity, the love. The ring tells a story of who they've become and who they're with. Tattoos are kind of like that. I don't have one, but they're the rage. Most people seem. How many tattoos in the room? Oh, maybe not. Okay, it depends on the crowd. Tattoos are kind of like that. If you ever see someone with a tattoo, I always like to ask, what's the story behind your tattoo? Because every tattoo tells a story of who someone is, of where they've come from, of who they know, who they're connected to. We humans love signs. We love symbols. Every single one of us in the room today has a sign and a symbol on our body of the greatest love. Like the greatest love, Wesley I'm blending his whole names together, Wesley Autry demonstrated. The greatest love he demonstrated. We all have a sign on our bodies, but it's not a ring and it's not a tattoo. It's a belly button. All of us have a physical reminder that we were once children in the womb. And those tell us a story, and the story they tell us is this. We were once weak and vulnerable. We were once totally dependent on our mothers who were more powerful. And in their powerful state, they could have ended our lives. They could have chosen abortion. And in doing that, they would have been declaring, "This is your body given for me." But we're here today with that physical symbol, sign, to remind us our moms didn't do that. That in carrying us to term, they communicated to us, "This is my body given for you." That is the greatest love. That's what Wesley Autry did on those train tracks. And when we're recipients of goodness, we want to share it. And how much more valuable is the gift of life than a cup of coffee? And if we would pay forward a free cup of coffee, how much more should we pay forward to others the gift of life that we've been recipients of? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. In the interest of time, I would love to jump to Q&A, and I know somewhere out there is someone with a microphone. So I appreciate your encouragement, and I would love to hear from you and address some things that I haven't yet addressed. So if you raise your hand, the microphone will come to you. I see a hand there, and then maybe the next person, make sure the microphone holder knows so they can get to you right away.
Hi, Stephanie. I met you in the hallway. I'm Annalisa. Nice to see you again. So in Florida, as you're aware, there is a bill on the table that would require written consent for underage girls to have an abortion. So with that being said, with the importance of it coming down to the state once Roe v. Wade is overturned, because that's the goal here, we obviously want to pass that bill. So from your perspective and experience, what would be the best way to rally for the support of the bill and to get it passed?
Good question. When it comes to trying to make any political change, I always say that public policy change is typically preceded by public opinion change. So I think what's so important is that you rally as many people as possible to do direct engagement, to entering into conversation and dialogue with the masses on college campuses, go outside high schools on the lunch hour where students are leaving the property and hand out pro-life literature, have pro-life messages, begin to ask them questions so that you educate more people who will then be the masses to influence the politicians when it comes to the time of voting. Do we have another question?
Hi, thanks for your speech, first off. I've been stumped a couple times by the answer to one of my questions as just, you're a man, you don't know anything about this, this is an issue that's just for women. Especially when it's coming from like an emotional standpoint. How do I answer that?
Good question. When someone dismisses you because you're a man, on a technical level, that would be what's called an ad hominem attack, where it's a fallacy in the realm of arguing, where you're attacking a person or their character or life experience rather than their argument. And you could call someone out on that technicality and say, well, if I was a woman who'd had an abortion, what would you then say? In order to get them focused on the argument rather than the individual. That's a technical thing you can do. However, what I often like to think is, what's behind the words? Why are they saying this? And perhaps, and it's only a theory, but I've seen it lived out in front of me on a number of occasions, perhaps what they're really communicating is, I've been in a tough situation, you have no idea, and you will actually never know what that's like. And so in some way, we want to validate that while not changing our position or our declaration. And so I'll often tell a little story, and I'll say to someone, I agree with you that I don't know that experience. And I can say that certainly having not been pregnant. So I'm often dismissed just as men can be, because they'll say, well, you don't know what it's like yet. But you can say, okay, I agree, I don't know what it's like. Let me ask you a question. Imagine someone has cancer, and they have a friend who's had a different type of cancer, but they've experienced that and survived, and they have access to the best oncologist in their city who's been very successful in fighting that particular type of cancer. When it comes time for treatment, is the person with cancer going to go to their friend who had a different type of cancer, or are they going to go to the oncologist who's the best at fighting that one? Who are they going to go to? The oncologist. But when they need a shoulder to cry on, when they want to just complain and vent and just want to hear someone say, I get it, it sucks. Are they going to go to the oncologist, or are they going to go to the friend who had the different type of cancer? They're going to go to the friend. I would have this exact dialogue I'm having with you with this person. And I would say, what that tells me is when we're just looking for empathy or understanding, anyone can give that. But in a special way, someone who's been there, done that, experienced it, can really validate something. And I admit, I don't know that experience. I want to give you kindness and compassion, but I don't know that experience. But as you've acknowledged, when it comes to actually treating cancer, you go to the oncologist. And my understanding of this conversation is we're just debating whether the act of abortion is moral or immoral. If we're talking about whose shoulder someone should cry on, fair enough, maybe that's not me. But if we're talking about is the act of abortion an ethical solution to what you and I can agree is a tough situation, that's kind of like the oncologist. We don't need to know the experience of cancer. He doesn't have to have cancer, but we need to know biology. We need to know philosophy. We need to know human rights. And can we dialogue about that? And I'd see how they respond. Next question.
Hi, thank you for being here. To tie in with the question and answer that you just gave, there's a lot of people in this world, no matter what age, that are afraid to talk about their testimony, their Christian testimony, and also talk about pro-life for fear of getting shut down, for fear of not being able to interchange, and you start butting heads and you don't ask those questions because you can't think that fast on your feet. What are some of the ways to get past the fear?
Good question. How do we get past fear that we have? A few ways. As a person of faith, I have to say the way to get past fear is to realize you're not running on your own strength, that we decrease so that Christ may increase. And so I think it's so important to be people of prayer who are constantly calling on the Holy Spirit to give us courage and to give us inspiration. The other thing to remember is, you might think, well, Stephanie's saying all this stuff and I'm not going to remember it all. Remember to ask questions and be kind. That's not hard to do. Whatever they say, what would be a good question back? And how do you communicate that in a kind way? And finally, when it comes to your own story and people maybe being afraid of sharing their own story, my golden rule for testimony sharing is this: share to the extent it helps the other person, not to the extent it helps you. Share to the extent it helps the other person, not to the extent it helps you. So if you're talking with someone and you say, I had an abortion, and they are rude to you and they dismiss you, don't take personal offense, because you shouldn't have been sharing for yourself. You should have been sharing to help them, and unfortunately, they didn't receive that help. Now, that doesn't mean we never share in a correct context of counseling, spiritual direction, or friend-to-friend relationships. We do, in fact, need to share for ourselves. But don't turn the testimony sharing into personal therapy. That has to be separate so that we are truly pouring out for the good of the other. We're other-oriented, not self-oriented, and therefore we don't need to be afraid, because I can't be hurt, because what I'm sharing isn't for me, it's for them. And then I trust God in some way will use that. Next question, thank you.
Being a pro-life person for a long time, I saw that when I came to Massachusetts. I am from Boston. Before, the priests were involved in talking about abortion, but at this time, I don't hear my parish priest talking anything about abortion. How can we get the priest in our parish talk a little more about abortion?
Yes, great question. So, we all have to be pro-life witnesses, but certainly we need our spiritual leaders, our priests, our pastors, our rabbis, whatever, to be preaching and forming. And if you go to my website, which is loveunleasheslife.com, it's my book name, my ministry name, loveunleasheslife.com. On my blog, I have a whole section on how to equip pastors to preach on this topic. I have sample sermons online. I have a suggested memorial service to aborted children that people can do at their parishes, at their churches. And so the website would be a great resource. But I think sitting down with your pastor, having a meeting with them, finding out if they haven't preached on abortion yet, would they be open to you providing some material to help them in that? If not, why? And be as gentle with them as we would with abortion supporters. Because if a pastor is hesitant to preach on abortion, there's going to be a reason. Perhaps they are afraid of backlash. Perhaps they're afraid of angry people, hurting people. Those are legitimate fears, but those fears shouldn't stop us from preaching. But we need to identify the fears in order to best address them and talk about how when we speak to abortion, the reaction from others should not dictate what we proclaim. That instead, the truth and God's commands are what should dictate what we proclaim. Having said that, how we proclaim matters. And if you proclaim poorly, you are going to get angry people, and they're having a natural reaction to poor preaching. But if you proclaim well, then even if there's a few people that are perhaps convicted of sin and don't like that, the vast majority, in my experience, will receive that message well. So we have to proclaim truth, but not all proclamation is equal, and so we need to help form pastors better, and loveunleasheslife.com will help that. Next question, I think we have about 7 minutes.
Hi, how do you combat the pro-choice argument that they don't want the government making laws on their body?
That they don't, sorry, what?
That they don't want the government making laws on their body.
So when someone says they don't want the government infringing on their body, I use a little story. I'll say, okay, let's imagine this. As I'm talking to you, as we're talking, if I want to go like this, it might be visually annoying to you. But I could say, this is my body, and I can do with it what I want, and the government can't create a law that says Stephanie Gray can't swing her arm when talking in the United States of America, right? But what if, as we're talking, I'll say to this person, I swing my arm so much that I hit someone in the nose? Would you stop me? Yes. Would the law stop me? Would that be considered, battery assault of some sort? Yes. So what if I were to respond to that government intervention and say, oh my goodness, this is my body. I have a right to do with my body what I want. Well, the government would say, well, what you're doing with your body is now inflicting harm on another body, and that's when we step in. So then we get back to that negative test versus the positive test. When a woman gets the positive test, there's another body there. The government ought to intervene because we expect parents to help their children, not harm their children. Next question.
Hi. So I know a lot of people who are pro-choice, and obviously I'm not one of them, but I always, we always have this back and forth. And I'll use an example like you did with the death penalty and a pregnant woman and a regular woman, and they'd be like, oh, that's not the same. But what examples can I use that they would understand?
Good question. So when we use these in some settings that don't seem to work, what that tells me is the problem isn't an intellectual one. If we aren't getting receptivity, and I do get receptivity when using this in some cases, but if in other cases we're not getting receptivity, that tells me it's a problem of the heart. That this person likely isn't accepting my logic because they have an emotional attachment to an abortion. Because maybe they had one, or they drove a friend to a clinic, or their mums had one, or they were silent when they should have spoken up. And they feel guilty by that omission or commission, and unless they repent of it, they're going to sit in a stew of justification. And so therefore, my tact is to still ask questions and have stories, but the kinds of questions I ask are to draw the story out of them rather than out of me. So I will ask a question like, you seem pretty passionate about this issue. I'm curious, where does your passion come from? Who knows what they'll say, but that might be the moment of reveal. Well, my mom had an abortion. Oh, how's your mom doing? Does she ever talk about that? Was that before you were born or after? Because she might have a whole identity crisis, maybe a bad relationship with her mom, and thinks, I bet my mom wishes she aborted me instead. Or her thinking might be, I love my mom, and if I say abortion is wrong, does that mean I hate my mom? But of course, that's not logical, because we shouldn't text and drive, but if our loved one texts and drives and kills someone, we're still gonna love that person even though we don't support texting and driving. So we can see a distinction between a behavior and a person. In fact, we're gonna love the person all the more because we're gonna feel so bad that they have to live with that regret. So we can hate what our moms did if they had abortions without hating our moms, but we need to learn this in order to deal with it. Another question I like to ask people is this: when did you first learn about abortion, and how old were you, and what'd you think? Oh, did your position change? Oh, when did it change? Why? Because if they told you I went to Catholic school and I was so smart in grade 7 and I thought abortion was wrong and then I got enlightened in college, well, that tells me something happened in college. And we need to know what that something is in order to get to the heart of the issue. Another question.
Hi, how you doing?
Hi.
So on my campus, the Planned Parenthood Club advocates that there's another position in between pro-life and pro-choice. They say that a woman can be pro-life and pro-choice by saying that they themselves would never get an abortion but would still support that right for other women. And a lot of people I debate with on campus will come with that stance.
Yes.
How would you argue against that?
Good question. So I've already conveyed to you, I get a lot of inner dialogue that goes in my head and doesn't always come out of my mouth. So the inner dialogue that goes through my head right now is from the book of Revelation: be hot or cold, but lukewarm, and I will vomit you out of my mouth. Now, we can laugh, but we all actually need to take that to heart and make sure that we never have a lukewarmness in our life that we ought not have. That is the favorite position of abortion supporters because it is the most attractive. It is the most appealing. And that's how Satan works. He puts sheep's clothing on wolves and makes things look appealing and soft and cuddly and fuzzy. So that's what we need to be very aware of, what we're dealing with in that situation, which is why, to maintain courage and resist fear, we need to be people of prayer and ask for divine inspiration. The next point I would make is to say, okay, taking what you've said, imagine this. Imagine I say to you, look, I'm against slavery. I think it's terrible. I think it's very wrong. I would never own a slave. But if my neighbor wants to own a slave, I mean, who am I to tell them they can't? I can't force my views on them. Would you accept that position? If they say no, I'd say why. They would say because slavery is a moral issue, not a preference issue, like what flavor of ice cream is the best. I mean, slavery involves harming other humans, and if it's wrong for you, it's wrong for everyone. I would say, okay, well, if you believe that on some issues the government should step in, that we ought to tell others they shouldn't do certain things because it harms others, then wouldn't abortion be an example of that? Because it harms a life. And then if they say, well, no, it doesn't harm a life, then we're back to the earlier remarks of, do you believe in human rights? When do humans begin? And so forth. I would love to keep speaking because, as my little niece says, Auntie Steph, you're a big talker. However, that little light at the back is flashing at me. I'm here for the afternoon and will happily speak with you in the hallway. God bless you.